Currency Wars: The Making of the Next Global Crisis. Written by James Rickards. Narrated by Walter Dixon. Preface. On August 15, 1971, a quiet Sunday evening, President Richard Nixon took to the airwaves, preempting the most popular television show in America, to announce his new economic policy. The government was imposing national price controls and a steep surtax on foreign imports and banning the conversion of dollars into gold. The country was in the midst of a crisis, the result of an ongoing currency war that had destroyed faith in the U.S. dollar, and the president had determined that extreme measures were necessary. Today, we are engaged in a new currency war, and another crisis of confidence in the dollar is on its way. This time the consequences will be far worse than those confronting Nixon. The growth in globalization, derivatives, and leverage over the past 40 years have made financial panic and contagion all but impossible to contain. The new crisis will likely begin in the currency markets and spread quickly to stocks, bonds, and commodities. When the dollar collapses, the dollar-denominated markets will collapse too. Panics will quickly spread throughout the world. As a result, another U.S. president, possibly President Obama, will take to the airwaves and cyberspace to announce a radical plan of intervention to save the dollar from complete collapse, involving legal authority already in place today. This new plan may even involve a return to the gold standard. If gold is used, it will be at a dramatically higher price in order to support the bloated money supply with the fixed quantities of gold available. Americans who had invested in gold earlier will be confronted with a 90% windfall profits tax on their newfound wealth, imposed in the name of fairness. European and Japanese gold presently stored in New York will be confiscated and converted to use in service of the new dollar policy. No doubt the Europeans and Japanese will be given receipts for their former gold, convertible into new dollars at a new, higher price. Alternatively, the president may eschew a return to gold and use an array of capital controls and global IMF money creation to reliquefy and stabilize the situation. This IMF global bailout will not be in old, non-convertible dollars, but in a newly printed global currency called the SDR. Life will go on, but the international monetary system will never be the same. This isn't far-fetched speculation. It has all happened before. Time and again, paper currencies have collapsed, assets have been frozen, gold has been confiscated, and capital controls have been imposed. The United States has not been immune to these acts. In fact, America has been a leading advocate of dollar debasement from the 1770s to the 1970s, through the Revolution, the Civil War, the Great Depression, and Carter-era hyperinflation. The fact that a currency collapse has not happened in a generation just implies that the next crash is overdue. This is not a matter of guesswork. The preconditions are already in place. Today, the U.S. Federal Reserve, under the guidance of Chairman Ben Bernanke, is engaged in the greatest gamble in the history of finance. Beginning in 2007, the Fed fought off economic collapse by cutting short-term interest rates and lending freely. Eventually, rates reached zero, and the Fed appeared to be out of bullets. Then in 2008, the Fed found a new bullet: quantitative easing. While the Fed describes the program as an easing of financial conditions through the lowering of long-term interest rates, this is essentially a program of printing money to spur growth. The Fed is attempting to inflate asset prices, commodity prices, and consumer prices to offset the natural deflation that follows a crash. It is basically engaged in a game of tug-of-war against the deflation that normally accompanies a depression. As in a typical tug-of-war, not much happens at first. The teams are evenly matched, and there is no motion for a while, just a lot of tension on the rope. Eventually, one side will collapse, and the other side will drag the losers over the line to claim victory. This is the essence of the Fed's gamble. It must cause inflation before deflation prevails. It must win the tug-of-war. In a tug-of-war, the rope is the channel through which stress is conveyed from one side to the other. This audiobook is about that rope. In the contest between inflation and deflation, the rope is the dollar. The dollar bears all the stress of the opposing forces and sends that stress around the world. The value of the dollar is the way to tell who is winning the tug of war. This particular tug of war is actually a full-on currency war, and it is not really a game, but an attack on the value of every stock, bond, and commodity in the world. In the best of all possible worlds for the Fed, asset values are propped up, banks get healthier, government debt melts away, and no one seems to notice. Yet, by printing money on an unprecedented scale, Bernanke has become a 21st century Pangloss, hoping for the best and quite unprepared for the worst. There is a very real danger that the Fed's money printing could suddenly morph into hyperinflation. Even if inflation does not affect consumer prices, it can show up in asset prices, leading to bubbles in stocks, commodities, land, and other hard assets. Bubbles that are prone to burst like tech stocks in 2000 or housing in 2007. The Fed claims to have the tools needed to avert these outcomes, but those tools have never been tried in these circumstances, or on such a large scale. The Fed's remedies, higher rates and tight money, are likely to lead straight to the kind of depression the Fed set out to avoid in the first place. The U.S. economy is resting on a knife's edge between depression and hyperinflation. Millions of investors, business owners, and workers wonder how much longer the Fed can balance the knife. Worse yet, none of this happens in a vacuum. If the Fed's policy manipulations were limited to the U.S. economy, that would be one thing, but they are not. The effects of printing dollars are global. By engaging in quantitative easing, the Fed has effectively declared currency war on the world. Many of the feared effects of the Fed policy in the United States are already appearing overseas. Printing dollars at home means higher inflation in China, higher food prices in Egypt, and stock bubbles in Brazil. Printing money means that U.S. debt is devalued, so foreign creditors get paid back in cheaper dollars. The devaluation means higher unemployment in developing economies as their exports become more expensive for Americans. The resulting inflation also means higher prices for inputs needed in developing economies, like copper, corn, oil, and wheat. Foreign countries have begun to fight back against U.S.-caused inflation through subsidies, tariffs, and capital controls. The currency war is expanding fast. While Fed money printing on a trillion-dollar scale may be new, currency wars are not. Currency wars have been fought before, twice in the 20th century alone, and they always end badly. At best, currency wars offer the sorry spectacle of countries stealing growth from trading partners. At worst, they degenerate into sequential bouts of inflation, recession, retaliation, and actual violence, as the scramble for resources leads to invasion and war. The historical precedents are sobering enough, but the dangers today are even greater, exponentially increased by the scale and complexity of financial linkages throughout the world. Baffling to many observers is the rank failure of economists to foresee or prevent the economic catastrophes of recent years. Not only have their theories failed to prevent calamity, they are making the currency wars worse. The economists' latest solutions, such as the global currency called the SDR, present hidden new dangers while resolving none of the current dilemmas. Among the new dangers are threats not just to America's economic well-being, but to our national security as well. As national security experts examine currency issues traditionally left to the Treasury, new threats continually come into focus, from clandestine gold purchases by China to the hidden agendas of sovereign wealth funds. Greater than any single threat is the ultimate danger of the collapse of the dollar itself. Senior military and intelligence officials have now come to the realization that America's unique military predominance can be maintained only with an equally unique and predominant role for the dollar. If the dollar fails, America's national security falls with it. While the outcome of the currency war is not yet certain, some version of the worst-case scenario is almost inevitable if U.S. and world economic leaders fail to learn from mistakes of their predecessors. This audiobook examines our current currency war through the lens of economic policy, national security, and historical precedent. It untangles the web of failed paradigms, wishful thinking, and arrogance driving current public policy, and points the way toward a more informed and effective course of action. In the end, the listener will understand why the new currency war is the most meaningful struggle in the world today, the one struggle that determines the outcome of all others. Part 1. War Games. Chapter 1. Pre-War. The current international currency system is the product of the past. Hu Jintao, General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, January 16, 2011. The Applied Physics Laboratory, located on 400 acres of former farmland about halfway between Baltimore and Washington, D.C., is one of the crown jewels of America's system of top-secret, high-tech applied physics and weapons research facilities. It operates in close coordination with the Department of Defense, and its specialties include advanced weaponry and deep space exploration. Lab officials are proud to tell visitors that the Earth's moon and every planet in the solar system has a device developed at APL either on its surface or passing nearby. The Applied Physics Lab was set up in haste in 1942, shortly after the Pearl Harbor attack, to bring applied science to the problem of improving weaponry. Much of what the U.S. military was using in the early days of World War II was either obsolete or ineffective. The lab was originally housed in a former used car dealership, requisitioned by the War Department on Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland. It operated in secrecy from the start, although in the early days the secrecy was enforced with just a few armed guards, rather than the elaborate sensors and multiple security perimeters used today. APL's first mission was to develop the Variable Time, or VT, proximity fuse, an anti-aircraft fuse used to defend naval vessels from air attack, later regarded, along with the atomic bomb and radar, as one of the three greatest technology contributions to U.S. victory in World War II. Based on this initial success, APL's programs, budget, and facilities have been expanding ever since. The Tomahawk cruise missile, Aegis missile defense, and one-of-a-kind spacecraft are among the many advanced weapons and space systems developed for the Defense Department and NASA by APL in recent decades. In addition to weapons and space exploration, there has always been a strong intellectual and strategic side to what the Applied Physics Laboratory does for the military. Preeminent among these more abstract functions is the lab's Warfare Analysis Laboratory, one of the leading venues for war games and strategic planning in the country. The lab's proximity to Washington, D.C. makes it a favorite for warfighting simulations, and it has played host to many such games over the decades. It was for this purpose, the conduct of a war game sponsored by the Pentagon, that about 60 experts from the military, intelligence, and academic communities arrived at APL on a rainy morning in the late winter of 2009. This war game was to be different from any other that had ever been conducted by the military. The rules of engagement prohibited what the military calls kinetic methods, things that shoot or explode. There would be no amphibious invasions, no special forces, no armored flanking maneuvers. Instead, the only weapons allowed would be financial: currencies, stocks, bonds, and derivatives. The Pentagon was about to launch a global financial war using currencies and capital markets instead of ships and planes. At the dawn of the 21st century, U.S. military dominance in conventional and advanced high-tech weapons systems, and in what the military calls 4CI, for command, control, communications, computers, and intelligence, had become so great that no rival nation would dare confront her. This does not mean wars are impossible. A rogue nation such as North Korea might escalate an incident into a major attack without heed to the consequences. The United States might be drawn into a war involving others such as Iran and Israel if U.S. national interests were affected. Apart from these special situations, a conventional military confrontation with the United States seems highly unlikely because of the United States' ability to suppress and ultimately decimate the opposing side. As a result, rival nations and transnational actors such as jihadists have increasingly developed capabilities in unconventional warfare, which can include cyber warfare, biological or chemical weapons, and other weapons of mass destruction. Or now, in the most unexpected twist of all, financial weapons. The financial war game was the Pentagon's first effort to see how an actual financial war might evolve, and to see what lessons might be learned. The war game had been many months in the making, and I had been part of the strategy sessions and game design that preceded the actual game. Although a well-designed war game will try to achieve unexpected results and simulate the fog of real war, it nevertheless requires some starting place and a set of rules in order to avoid descending into chaos. APL's game design team was among the best in the world at this, but a financial game required some completely new approaches, including access to Wall Street expertise, which the typical physicist or military planner does not have. My role was to fill that gap. My association with the lab started in December 2006 in Omaha, Nebraska, where I was attending a strategy forum hosted by U.S. Strategic Command, or STRATCOM. I presented a paper on the new science of market intelligence, or what intelligence experts call MarkInt, which involves analyzing capital markets to find actionable intelligence on the intentions of market participants. Hedge funds and investment banks have been using these methods for years to gain information advantage on takeovers and government policy shifts. Now, along with my partners, Chris Ray, a seasoned options trader and risk manager, and Randy Taus, recently retired after 35 years with the CIA, we had developed new ways to use these techniques in the national security realm to identify potential terrorist attacks in advance and to gain early warning of attacks on the U.S. dollar. Several members of the APL Warfare Analysis Lab had been in attendance at the Omaha event and later contacted me about ways we might work together to integrate MarkInt concepts with their own research. So it was not a surprise when I received a call in the summer of 2008 to join a global financial seminar sponsored by the Office of the Secretary of Defense and hosted by APL. It was scheduled for that December. Its stated purpose to examine the impact of global financial activities on national security issues. This was one of a series of such seminars planned by the Defense Department to be held throughout the late summer and fall of that year as a preparation for the financial war game itself. Defense wanted to know if such a game was even possible, if it made sense. They needed to think about the appropriate teams. Would they be countries, sovereign wealth funds, banks, or some combination? They also needed to think about remote but still plausible scenarios for the players to enact. A list of expert participants had to be developed, and some recruitment might be needed to reach out to those who had not been involved with war games before. Finally, rules had to be established for the actual play. To protect the top-secret work that goes on inside the lab, the security procedures for visitors there are as strict as at any U.S. government defense or intelligence installation, starting with advance clearance and background checks. Upon arrival, visitors are quickly sorted into two categories: no escort or escort required, reflected in different colored badges. The practical impact of this has mainly to do with trips to the coffee machine, but the implicit understanding is that those with the no escort badges hold current high security clearances from their home directorates or government contractors. BlackBerries, iPhones, and other digital devices have to be deposited at the security desk to be retrieved upon departure. X-ray scanners, metal detectors, multiple security perimeters, and armed guards are routine. Once inside, you are truly in the bubble of the military intelligence complex. At the September meeting, there were about 40 attendees in total, including a number of distinguished academics, think tank experts, intelligence officials, and uniformed military. I was one of 5 asked to give a formal presentation that day, and my topic was Sovereign Wealth Funds, or SWFs. Sovereign wealth funds are huge investment pools established by governments to invest their excess reserves, many with assets in the $100 billion range or higher. The reserves are basically hard currency surpluses, mostly dollars, which governments have earned by exporting natural resources or manufactured goods. The largest reserves are held by oil-producing countries such as Norway or Arab states, and by manufacturing export powerhouses such as China or Taiwan. Traditionally, these reserves were managed by central banks of these countries in a highly conservative manner. Investments were limited to low-risk, liquid instruments such as U.S. Treasury bills. This strategy offered liquidity but did not provide much income, and it tended to concentrate a large amount of the portfolio in just one type of investment. In effect, the surplus countries were placing all their eggs in one basket and not getting very much in return. Because of the drastic increase in the size of the reserves beginning in the 1990s, partly as the result of globalization, surplus countries began to seek out ways of getting higher returns on their investments. Central banks were not well equipped to do this because they lacked the investment staff and portfolio managers needed to select stocks, commodities, private equity, real estate, and hedge funds, which were the key to higher returns. So, the sovereign wealth funds began to emerge to better manage these investments. The earliest SWFs were created some decades ago, but most have come into being in the past 10 years, with their government sponsors giving them enormous allocations from their central bank reserves with a mandate to build diversified portfolios of investments from around the world. In their basic form, sovereign wealth funds do make economic sense. Most assets are invested professionally and contain no hidden political agenda. But this is not always the case. Some purchases are vanity projects, such as Middle Eastern investments in the McLaren, Aston Martin, and Ferrari Formula One racing teams, while other investments are far more politically and economically consequential. During the first part of the Depression that began in 2007, sovereign wealth funds were the primary source of bailout money. In late 2007 and early 2008, SWFs invested over $58 billion to prop up Citigroup, Merrill Lynch, UBS, and Morgan Stanley. China was considering an additional $1 billion investment in Bear Stearns in early 2008 that was abandoned only when Bear Stearns neared collapse in March of that year. When these investments were decimated in the panic of 2008, the U.S. government had to step in with taxpayer money to continue the bailouts. The sovereign wealth funds lost vast fortunes on these early investments, yet the stock positions and the influence that came with them remained. My presentation focused on the dark side of SWF investments, how they could operate through what intelligence analysts call cutouts or front companies, such as trusts, managed accounts, private Swiss banks, and hedge funds. With these fronts in place, sovereign wealth funds could then be used to exercise malign influence over target companies in order to steal technology, sabotage new projects, stifle competition, engage in bid rigging, recruit agents, or manipulate markets. I did not assert that such activities were common, let alone the norm, but rather that such activities were possible, and the United States needed to develop a stronger watch function to protect its national security interests. Along with these specific threats, I suggested an even greater threat, a full-scale attack on Western capital markets to disable the engine of capitalist society. My presentation included metrics and system specifications to monitor sovereign wealth fund behavior, to look for behind-the-scenes malign acts, and to identify financial choke points, the information age equivalents of the Suez Canal or the Strait of Hormuz, which could be monitored to prevent or fight off future financial attacks. By the end of the two-day event, the Defense Department officials in attendance seemed satisfied that the lab had developed a solid core of experts, subjects, and threat analysis with which to take the war game to the next level. The core group of experts met again at the lab the following month to continue developing the financial war game. In addition to the APL hosts and our sponsors from the Department of Defense, there were representatives from other cabinet-level departments, including Commerce and Energy, several major universities, including the Naval War College, think tanks, including the Peterson Institute and Rand Corporation, other physics labs, including Los Alamos, and senior military officers from the staff of the Joint Chiefs. At this point, I noticed the absence of representatives with any actual capital markets experience. I was the only one in the room with a lengthy career on Wall Street that included time at investment banks, hedge funds, and exchanges. If we were going to conduct a financial war, we needed people who knew how to use financial weapons, such as front-running, inside information, rumors, painting the tape with misleading price quotes, short squeezes, and the rest of the tricks on which Wall Street thrives. We needed people who, in the immortal words of legendary banker John Goodfriend, were ready to bite the ass off a bear when it came to trading currencies, stocks, and derivatives. There was no lack of testosterone among the uniformed military or the spies in the room, but they knew no more about destroying a country with credit default swaps than the average stock trader knew about the firing sequence for an ICBM. If this project was going to succeed, I had to persuade defense to let me recruit some of my peers to make the game more realistic and more valuable for them. At the October session, I gave a presentation on futures and derivatives to explain how these leveraged instruments could be used to manipulate underlying physical markets, including those in strategic commodities such as oil, uranium, copper, and gold. I also explained how the prohibition of derivatives regulation in the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, legislation led by Senator Phil Gramm and signed by President Clinton in 2000, had opened up the door to exponentially greater size and variety in these instruments that were now hidden off the balance sheets of the major banks, making them almost impossible to monitor. I finished with a picture of how cutouts, sovereign wealth funds, and derivatives leverage could be combined to launch a financial Pearl Harbor for which the United States was completely unprepared. The pre-game seminars were beginning to achieve their purpose. The military, intelligence, and diplomatic experts were now on the same page as the financial types. The threat of financial warfare was becoming clearer. Our third group planning session took place in mid-November. This time there were a few new faces, including senior officials from the intelligence community. We were no longer contemplating the feasibility of a financial war game. By now, it was game on, and we were specifically focused on game design. I presented detailed financial warfare scenarios and made a pitch that the game design should incorporate unpredictable outcomes that would surprise both attackers and defenders due to the complex dynamics of capital markets. By the conclusion, the Defense Department and the APL game design team had received enough input from the experts to complete the final design. All that remained was to select the participants, set the date, and let the game begin. After some delays and uncertainty during the changeover of administrations, the Obama administration gave the go-ahead to proceed as planned. The formal invitations went out in late January 2009. The war game would be played out over 2 days, March 17th and 18th at the APL Warfare Analysis Laboratory inside the imposing war room it had used in many past simulations. All war games have certain elements in common. They involve 2 or more teams, or cells, which are customarily designated either by the names of countries involved or by colors. A typical game might involve a red cell, usually bad guys, versus a blue cell, the good guys, although some games have multiple sides. One critical cell is the white cell, which consists of a game director and participants designated as umpires or referees. The white cell decides if a particular game move is allowed and also determines who wins or loses during each round of the game. Generally, the game designers attribute specific goals or objectives to each cell. Thereafter, the players are expected to make moves that logically advance those objectives, rather than move off in unexplained directions. The game design team will also use political scientists, military strategists, and other analysts to describe the initial conditions affecting all the players. In effect, they determine the starting line. Finally, some system of power metrics is devised so that the relative strength of each cell can be established at the beginning of the game, in the same way that some armies are larger than others or some economies have greater industrial potential at the start of any war. Once in play, the participants will then direct the moves for each cell, with the white cell adding or subtracting points from each competing cell based on its assessment of the success or failure of each move. Other design features include specifying the number of days over which the game will be conducted and the number of moves on each day. This is an important practical constraint because many of the outside experts find it difficult to be away from their other professional duties for more than 2 or 3 days at a time. I was not a wargame expert, but I was the designated Wall Street expert, so I worked side by side with the game designers to fit the world I knew into the categories, timelines, rules, and budgets that they had within their parameters. One of my main goals was to make sure that the game design allowed for unconventional scenarios. I knew that a real financial attack would not involve anything as obvious as dumping treasury notes on the open market, because the president has near dictatorial powers to freeze any accounts that try to disrupt the market in that way. An attack would almost certainly involve hard-to-identify cutouts and hard-to-track derivatives. Above all, a financial attack would almost certainly involve the dollar itself. Destroying confidence in the dollar would be far more effective than dumping any particular dollar-denominated instrument. If the dollar collapsed, all dollar-denominated markets would collapse with it, and the president's powers to freeze accounts would be moot. I wanted to make sure the game design would allow for a true currency war, and not just a war of stocks, bonds, and commodities. The final pieces were falling into place. The team decided we would definitely play a U.S. cell, a Russia cell, and a China cell. In addition, there would be a Pacific Rim cell, which would include Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam, among others. This was not ideal because, as separate states, South Korea and Taiwan, for instance, could take very different positions depending on the issue involved. But these kinds of compromises were necessary to stick to our budget and get the game off the ground. There would also be a gray cell to represent the rest of the world. I was not sure how pleased real Europeans would be to learn that they did not get their own cell and would have to share their platform with the IMF, hedge funds, and the Cayman Islands. Finally, of course, was the all-powerful white cell, directing course and calling the shots as the game played out. The game would have 3 moves played over 2 days. 2 moves would be played on day 1, and 1 additional move on day 2, with time at the end for debriefing. The cells would have private facilities to use as their capitals for deciding each move, and there would be plenary sessions in the war room, where cells would make their moves and their opponents would respond. The white cell would preside over the plenary sessions and award or subtract power points to each cell's National Power Index. Cells could conduct bilateral summits or negotiations with other cells at designated locations while each turn was being played. Most intriguingly, each cell would have a set of wild cards that allowed for actions and responses not included in the opening set of scenarios for each turn. Although this was being conducted for the first time on a tight budget, and the results were far from clear at the outset, the combination of summit conferences and wild cards was enough to suggest that we might show the Pentagon how real, unconventional warfare could occur. As we completed our overview, I again pointed out that we were top-heavy with military, intelligence, and think tank participants, but didn't have anyone from Wall Street except me. I knew we were going to get very predictable action-response functions by inviting the usual suspects. These people are brilliant on macroeconomics and strategy, but none of them really understands how capital markets function in the trenches. I told them I wanted to recruit some investment bankers and hedge fund people to join us. There was room in the budget for 2 more participants, they said, and I could have my pick. My first recruit was Steve Halliwell, a seasoned banker and private equity investor. Steve is trim, dapper, animated, and highly recognizable with his thick-framed glasses and shaved head. He is the epitome of the old Russia hand, having made his first trip to Russia in 1963 during the Kennedy-Khrushchev era as an early exchange student, while an undergraduate at Wesleyan. He later went to grad school at Columbia and had a long career at Citibank, where he was involved in opening Citibank's Moscow branch before he launched one of the first U.S.-Russia investment funds in the 1990s. Steve's supply of Russian anecdotes is inexhaustible, and he tells each one in vivid detail with a strong sense of humor. He speaks Russian like a native and has a dense network of connections in that country as a result of his banking and investment activities. Steve and I had spent a week in Moscow in the winter of 2008 doing market research for some hedge fund clients of mine. The trip was memorable for the beauty of the nighttime snowfall on Red Square and copious amounts of vodka and caviar consumed with our Russian hosts. I knew he'd be perfect to play the Russian side in the Pentagon's financial game. He readily agreed to come on board. Now, I had one more recruitment to make. Since Steve was a private equity fund guy and a more long-term investor, I wanted someone closer to the day-to-day action of the markets, someone who understood what are called technicals, that is, short-term supply and demand imbalances that could push security prices away from their fundamental values and catch supposedly rational investors off guard. I needed someone who knew every trick in the book when it came to handling the kind of huge orders that could push markets around and steamroll the unsuspecting. I called a friend who had been in the trenches for over 30 years and was known on the street as O.D. I had known Bill O'Donnell for decades, going back to our days at Greenwich Capital, the primary dealer in government bonds. Bill is one of the smartest salespeople around and always has a smile, except when he's working hard on an order for a customer. He's never in a bad mood and never loses his temper, which is unusual on a trading floor. Sporting wavy salt and pepper hair, preppy clothes, and good looks, Bill has an easygoing demeanor that makes him one of the most well-liked people in the bond business, otherwise known for its share of off-putting A-type personalities. He loves the business and has seen it all, from the beginning of the bull market in 1982 through the housing bubble years beginning in 2002. When I called him in 2009, he was working as head of interest rate strategy for banking giant UBS at their North American headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut. As with a lot of Wall Street folks I had recruited for help on national security projects, he grasped the situation immediately and could not wait to volunteer. After running it by his bosses at UBS, he called me back a few days later. "I'm in," he said. "Just tell me where I need to be. This will be great to mix things up with the generals and intelligence people. Can't wait." And that was that. Steve was assigned to the Russia cell, of course. O.D. was assigned to the Gray cell, representing the hedge funds and Swiss banks, another appropriate assignment. I was put in the China cell, along with a well-known Harvard academic, a highly cerebral Rand Corporation analyst, and 2 other area experts. The financial war was just a few weeks away, and it was time to lay some traps, something the military calls conditioning the battle space. I knew that Russia would begin the game with significantly less national power than the United States or even China. In fact, the national power assessment showed Russia having about only 2/3 the strength of the United States, with China somewhere between the two. As far as I was concerned, this just meant that Russia would have to play smarter and harder and do something unconventional to set the United States back on its heels. As an American concerned about the economic course we were on and our vulnerabilities to financial attack, I wanted the United States to suffer some kind of shock or setback in the game environment. That seemed like the best way to do our jobs for America and open some eyes at the Defense Department and in the intelligence community before a serious setback took place in the real world. The fact that Steve, O.D., and I were playing non-U.S. teams left us in a position to deliver a shock. The fact that we had less national power to start with just meant that we would have to be more creative and more stealthy. 1020 Post is a popular bistro in Darien, Connecticut, near where I live and not far from Steve's home in Westchester County, New York. It's also become a hangout for investment bankers from RBS and UBS in nearby Stamford. With its mahogany bar, brass fixtures, glass chandeliers, and white tablecloths, it conjures up the look and feel of a classic French original. I suggested to Steve that we meet there for dinner 1 week before the game to work out a scheme to put the United States on the defensive. Over oysters, white wine, and vodka toasts of Nostrovia, we reminisced a little about our Moscow adventures and then got down to business. I handed Steve a mock press release from the Russian Central Bank, something I had written earlier and used in a few articles and lectures. It said that Russia was moving its gold to Switzerland and starting a new bank in London. The bank would issue a new form of gold-backed currency supported by gold in the Swiss vaults. Initially, Russia would own all of the new currency, but everyone would be free to deposit gold and receive similar currency. It had other technical features to make the plan feasible, such as lending and clearing facilities. The kicker was that from now on, any Russian exports of oil or natural gas would have to be paid for in the new currency. U.S. dollars would no longer be welcome. "Jim, I'm worried about you. You're starting to think like a Russian," Steve said. "Coming from you, that's high praise," I replied. "Why are you using Switzerland and London in this?" "No one trusts the Russians not to steal the gold," I said. "But they trust the Swiss and the Brits, so if you do everything under their legal systems, people won't be afraid to deposit the gold." "Right. Russia has been looking for a way out of the dollar system for years. They try and play by our rules and get screwed every time," said Steve. "This is perfect for them." "Now, here's the deal," I said, leaning toward Steve. "If you play this move for Russia, I'll get the Chinese team to go along. If you can't get Russia to make the move, I'll launch this idea from China myself. Either way, we'll work this into the game and try to sink the dollar. That will be a shock to the U.S. The Pentagon is paying to learn something from this. Let's give them their money's worth." Steve took the mock press release, folded it, and tucked it inside his jacket to study in detail at home. We finished our vodka and left ready to spring our sneak attack on the dollar. Now Steve, O.D., and the rest of us were ready to start the war. Over those 2 days, the game would quickly take on a life of its own and open a lot of eyes to how markets work and how financially vulnerable nations actually are.